It's April 5th. Ukraine Media Center Ukraine Forum continues its operation. My name is Vasil Samkhvalov, and joining us in this studio is the spokesperson of the State Bodyguard Service of Ukraine, Andrii Demchenko, and we will be talking about the situation in our borders. And first question will be as follows. Yesterday, Belarus announced about the extraordinary inspection of its troops. They announced that they will have their troops march to the borders, including Ukrainian border. What was our reaction to that statement? Good afternoon, everybody. As to the border with Belarus, I would like to say that the situation in that direction remains under full control. Obviously, Belarus continues to support Russian Federation in their aggression against Ukraine. However, there is no strike force which would be capable of invasion in Ukraine is not being observed by the reconnaissance and intelligence units of Ukraine. In its support of Russia, Belarus provides their territory for Russian forces, specifically for their training. They provide their airspace and multilaterally assists them in joint training of the forces of Belarus and Russian Federation, but it's mostly Russian military who are engaged in training over there. For the time being, after certain training for Russian units, there is a rotation of troops, and we know that currently there were measures taken as to withdrawal of the part of Russian units back to Russian Federation upon their training. Recently we reported that there was around 4,000 Russian military in Ukraine, in Belarus. After the measures that I've just mentioned, their number will reduce, and according to the intelligence we have, around 2,000 Russian military will be withdrawn from Belarus, which will be later engaged in reinforcement of Russian forces in Ukraine. The units of Belarusian military that are along the borders of Ukraine, they are located at certain distance. Neither their composition nor the nature of their action is being changed. However, we still have to be ready for any development of the situation, because we understand that the enemy is cowardly and vile. So we take all necessary actions to reinforce the borderline and the areas along the borderlines. And the units of the State Bodyguard Service and Armed Forces of Ukraine and National Guard of Ukraine should have all the opportunities to repel the attack, the potential attack which may suddenly happen from that direction, or counter any provocations in that section of the border. Thank you very much. If we have questions on the floor, dear journalists, please go ahead. Yulia Gadina, Ukraine Forum. I have a couple of questions to you. First of all, it's about the situation in the border with occupied Crimea. Was the situation over there? And did the enemy increase the number of personnel in the spots where they built fortifications? Well, I think that more information may be provided to you by the General Staff or the units of military management, because the State Bodyguard servicemen, they also reinforced that area in the south, but the full comprehensive information may be provided by the General Staff, because I don't currently have information regarding the administrative border with the occupied Crimea to fully disclose the situation. Thank you. And another question will be with regard to the smuggling. Was the situation with the smuggling in the borders? Do we observe any reduction in amounts of smuggled goods after the 24th of February, after the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, we observe the decrease in attempts of illegal smuggling of goods through the borders of Ukraine, both in green part of the border and through the checkposts as well. But in a couple of months, when the situation was more or less stabilized, there were certain cases of smuggling of tobacco goods across the green section of the border, and lately we observe attempts of smuggling through the checkposts. First of all, I'm talking about the tobacco goods being transported, being attempted to be smuggled from Ukraine to Europe, and other goods including light industry products such as clothing. But generally the number of attempts of smuggling is significantly reduced comparing to the situation before the 24th of February.
My name is Lorenzo Cremonesi from Italian daily Corriere della Sera, and I have 2 or 3 questions to ask you. So let's ask one by one. First question, Transnistria. Do you know any accurate number of Russian troops there? Do you consider the border with Transnistria a dangerous border? Do you see any movement? Can you tell us a little bit about that situation? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. In that direction, I mean the border with Moldova, the Transnistria segment, that section is being paid a lot of attention in the same way that the border with aggressor country or the Belarus border. We understand that Transnistria is under the influence of Russia. However, for the time being, there were no significant provocations or threatening situations in that area. We don't observe sufficient forces to be able of initiating invasion of Ukraine. Russia may use that territory for provocations. That's why that area is reinforced along the border too, so that all the defense forces of Ukraine, which I mentioned, I mean the State Bodyguard Service of Ukraine, Armed Forces of Ukraine and National Guard, could have all opportunities to control the situation in that section and counter any provocations.
Up on this question, is it correct to assume the classic number 2,000, more or less 2,000 Russian soldiers in Transnistria today?
Well, I cannot give any specific details about this information. I apologize.
On the question of Belarus, actually you told us in spite of Lukashenko propaganda, declaration, position, you don't see any danger, any, let's say, any preparation for invasion as some months ago it was presented. You don't see that at the moment. That the bottom line of what you say before?
Yes, as I mentioned, in the territory of Belarus there is no sufficient troops which could create the strike force capable of invasion of Ukraine. But again, Ukrainian warriors are prepared for any development of the situation, because we understand that it could be not a repeated invasion, but it could be engagement of Belarusian troops in warfare against Ukraine. This is why we will kill all the enemies which would attempt of invading of our country.
Patient, I have a last question on this question of the border. If you look at the long Russian border, not Belarusia or Transnistria, but the long Russia border, there were rumors from Moscow mainly talking about concentration of troops trying again to attack on Kyiv direction, Belgorod situation near Sumy. If you look at this long border, I'm not asking you about, of course, Donbass or Crimea, which are actually hot border, but I'm talking about the long border, which is not at the moment fighting. Which section of this border you consider more dangerous when Russia can try to enter, or there is some military activity? Thank you. And that's over.
In the same way that in Belarus, in that direction that you mentioned, Russia doesn't have sufficient troops, sufficient forces, or the forces that could be formed or created in the borderline along Chernihiv or Sumy or Kharkiv region, which could be capable of repeated invasion of Ukraine. Obviously, the units of Russian Federation are staying there, they're being located there, and Russia continues to terrorize Ukraine on a daily basis, shelling Ukrainian territories that were deoccupied within Chernihiv, Sumy and Kharkiv regions. It is being done by them on a constant basis from the territory of Russia. They shell the territory of Ukraine using mortars, artillery, cannon artillery. There are multiple cases of use of aviation for the inflicting strikes on Ukraine. The small arms and tanks are being used too. The enemy also uses the unmanned aerial vehicles which drop explosive devices over Ukraine. At the same time, Russia neglects the lives of the civilians because the majority of shellings fall on the just regular settlements, destroying Ukrainians' houses, destroying infrastructure. And talking about the use of UAVs, for example, yesterday the enemy used two unmanned aerial vehicles to drop two explosive devices in Sumy region, which resulted in injury of a civilian. However, at the same time, meanwhile, Ukraine cannot fully reinforce the border with Russia. However, in the territories adjacent to the borderline, we do everything possible to fortify that area, to make sure that the defense forces of Ukraine have all possibilities to counter any attack, to repel any attack. Besides talking about the state bodyguard service units, we take all necessary steps and provided all the technical facilities that we have to counter the enemy unmanned aerial vehicles, which enemy also uses for reconnaissance and intelligence, and to disclose also the positions of Ukrainian defenders. I have another question. The offensive guard, one of the brigades, is being formed by the State Bodyguard Service of Ukraine. What's the situation with their creation? Well, the steel border, that unit which is being formed within the framework of the offensive guard, it fully consists of volunteers, the people who are motivated to submit their applications to become a part of the State Bodyguard Service of Ukraine. So we got 7,000 applications. Part of them was already considered, and those who comply with the conditions of entry, they are already in the ranks of State Bodyguard Service of Ukraine. The backbone consists of those who have combat experience, who fulfilled their combat duties in the east of Ukraine, and who were defending a country in the border with the aggressor. Now they undergo the training and battle coordination. All the servicemen who make up the brigade steel border, and after the coordination, the unit will fulfill duties on defending the borders of Ukraine in the east and it will act just like other units of the state border guard service on Ukraine in compliance with the general concept of the general staff of the armed forces of Ukraine, just like all the defense forces do. And the last question, crossing of the state border, any trends we should pay attention to, is anything changes? And there will be another question, summer is coming. For some people, those questions may be more interesting. For example, the parents who will want to take their children away from Ukraine, or the graduates of the school graduates, for example, the male school graduates, I mean, whether if they want to cross the border, is there anything to change for them? Well, I would like to comment about this. For example, currently the passenger flow has a trend to increase. It's related mostly to the Easter holidays. We started documenting increase of the passenger flow from the middle of last week. For example, previously there was 80,000 people crossing the border on a daily basis in both directions. From the middle of last week it grew up to 90,000, and during Saturday and Sunday it exceeded 102,000 people in both directions. Since yesterday the passenger flow fell again, but the indicators were at the level of 80,000 people per day. I would like to say that the correlation of citizens entering or leaving Ukraine was the same, 50-50%. There was no significant number of people either prevailing in the entrance or exit direction. However, I've seen certain Russian public channels which were trying to disseminate fake information that Ukrainians are fleeing Ukraine in mass. They were referencing the statements of State Border Guard Service that in fact were never made by the State Border Guard Service of Ukraine. There was no leaving of Ukraine in mass by the citizens of Ukraine lately. Besides that, this dynamic that I mentioned, 50-50%, within 3 months of this year, the passenger flow comparing to the indicators of the last year decreased 16%. Lately, the passenger flow, the entrance to Ukraine prevails by the Ukrainian citizens. It was mostly felt in on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. As I mentioned, it's mostly related to the Easter holidays. 80,000 people entered Ukraine last week, 80,000 people more than those who left Ukraine. Our compatriots are coming back home to spend this time in Ukraine specifically, and we see that these high dynamics of the passenger flow will be maintained until the end of the Easter holidays. Just like earlier, the citizens of Ukraine were crossing the border in the section of the border with Poland, which accounts for 50% of the entrance passenger flow, and the intensification of the passenger flow in some directions means the increase of the lines in the border. So according to the information from our Polish colleagues, during weekend there was mass concentration of vehicles in checkposts Shahini and Krakivets. In Krakivets it was more than 300 vehicles, and in Shahini it was more than 100 vehicles on the way to enter Ukraine during weekend. At the same time, other checkposts were almost empty, and it means that people, first of all, they pick the logistic route, coming in mass, which results in both concentration and long lines at the border. So I want to address all the civilians who are interested to cross the border. Please check the control services of the bordering countries, and we have references on our website to such services. And the portal of our Western Regional Department. So if you don't want to wait in line for a long time, pick the checkpost with the less concentration of vehicles and citizens trying to cross the line. Also, I would like to mention the subject of violation of the border. Fortunately, we don't document any increase in the attempts of illegal crossing the border. Our servicemen detain about 20 people on a daily basis who try to leave Ukraine. They commit such actions on the checkposts and on the green section of the border, I mean beyond the checkposts. For example, in the green section of the border, just like previously, the most attempts were documented in the border with Moldova and Romania, starting from the 24th February. More than 11,500 such violators were detained. Another 3,000 were detained at the checkposts, attempting to cross the border with forged documents in the borders with Poland and Hungary. I want to warn everybody to withhold from such actions because they entail administrative liability and certain actions may result in criminal liability. The agencies of the State Bodyguard Service of Ukraine, in coordination with other law enforcement agencies, take all necessary steps to disclose the activities of the groups which assist in illegal crossing of the border by Ukrainian citizens. For the time being, more than 2,500 criminal investigations are initiated related to illegal crossing of the border, and activity of more than 160 criminal groups is terminated, which was related to assistance of the illegal crossing of the border by citizens of Ukraine. Some people tried to use illegal routes, and one of such attempts was the attempt to use the Schlag system. And State Bodyguard Service is not the administrator of this system. Meanwhile, our servicemen, in fulfilling of our duties, identified multiple violations of crossing the border using the Schlag system. For example, upon the results of those steps taken within the last half a year, more than 4,000 persons were restricted from crossing the border. They were refused to leave the country. Meanwhile, they were entered as persons which were licensed to cross the border as a part of the businesses which are involved in logistics. Also, the State Bodyguard Service of Ukraine forwarded a number of notifications to the licensing authority regarding the businesses and the individuals who were trying to violate the state border. And for some of the licenses, there was a restriction for using the system, the Schlag system. Also, the licenses for some of the licensees was terminated due to the initiation of criminal investigations, and there was a number of people who received notice of suspicion due to attempts of violation of state border. This is why crossing of the state border in illegal manner is not worth it. I want to remind you that the male citizens of Ukraine aged from 18 to 60 years are restricted from crossing the border of Ukraine. However, the resolution number 57 includes a number of exclusions for the categories of people who are allowed to cross the border, provided the presence of certain documents. Besides, the government officials, according to the strictly identified category, may go outside Ukraine for a duty trip. Also, there are other exclusions for that category of government officials who may cross the border in the direction outside Ukraine, not only on a duty trip, but also to accompany the minors, the minor children, for the purposes of treatment or hospitalization, but that should be supported by the supplementary documents. Thank you.
You're touching a very, very hot, very interesting subject, and from the beginning of the war, practically, all journalists try to investigate, and finally we have some number from you. So sorry if I abuse your time and your patience. But sorry, of course, everybody here is interested, as you mentioned, the people are trying to avoid army, male between 18 and 60. Can you give us an idea how many men of military age had been caught from the beginning of the war trying to escape, trying to go abroad against the law? Can you give us a number? And if in this number you gave us 3,000 detention, 25,000 investigation, 160 criminal groups, with the three number that I picked up from your word, how many are in this category? I mean, people will try to avoid military service. Thank you.
Думаю, що важливо відзначити, що в рамках загальної кількості населення
Well, it should be mentioned that it's all within the statistic error. Well, as I mentioned, the number of violators who were detained in the green section of the border, I cannot segregate whether those people were fleeing mobilization or they were using some other reasons to cross the border in illegal manner, but the overall number of violators that were detained in the state border is more than 11,500 persons. That's again in the green section of the border, beyond checkposts.
From 24 February. Okay.
Yes, on the checkposts, we detained more than 4,200 persons which were attempting to leave Ukraine using forged documents. Besides, on a daily basis, why I emphasize the rules for crossing the state border, which stipulate who are allowed to cross the border. It's a comprehensive list. If anybody wants to cross the border, I call everybody to get familiarized with that list. On a daily basis, the servicemen of the State Bodyguard Service restrict about 150 persons from crossing the border due to the absence of necessary documents, or if they don't fall under the relevant rules for crossing the border of Ukraine in the direction of exit. Thank you very much for this information. Joining us was Andrii Demchenko, the spokesperson for the State Bodyguard Service of Ukraine. We were talking about the situation in our borders. So see you tomorrow.